In the waning years of the 19th century, nestled deep within the unforgiving spine of the Appalachian Mountains, lay the cold town of Sorrows Hollow. Here, night did not simply fall, it seeped up from the damp earth, a cold, heavy presence that smelled of wet soil, distant coal smoke, and the metallic tang of perpetual mist. It is in this oppressive darkness, circa 1898, that our chronicle begins. In the town cemetery, a solitary figure moves with a grim, practiced efficiency. This is Silas, the gravedigger. The rhythmic scrape of his shovel against the rocky soil is the only sound that dares to challenge the profound silence, a lonely percussion marking a labor the townsfolk prefer to ignore. His face, illuminated by the unsteady flicker of a lantern, is an impassive mask, his eyes betraying nothing of the cold resentment that festers within his soul. For him, this is not a sacred duty, it is merely a trade. While his hands toil in the freshly turned earth of a pauper's plot, Silas's gaze is drawn irresistibly toward a monument that defies the humble misery surrounding it. The Blackwood family mausoleum stands as a testament to Gilded Age opulence, a fortress of polished marble and ornate, wrought iron angels whose faces are frozen in perpetual, silent grief. It is less a tomb and more a palace for the dead, a final, ostentatious declaration of a fortune wrested from the very mountains that now cradle the town. To Silas, this structure is an obscenity, a stark symbol of the divide between the town's handful of coal barons and the impoverished masses who serve them. He does not see a memorial to a lost loved one. He sees a vault, a repository of wealth unjustly removed from the world of the living, a treasure chest just waiting to be opened. The mausoleum's most recent occupant is the source of both the town's public mourning and Silas's private obsession. Eleanor Blackwood, the young daughter of the town's wealthiest magnate. Her sudden death, officially attributed to a vague and poetic melancholy, sent a wave of ostentatious sorrow through the community. Funerals in Sorrows Hollow were typically stark affairs, but Eleanor's was a spectacle of imported flowers and somber finery. For Silas, however, the tragedy was a matter of cold calculus. He envisioned the decedent adorned in jewels, a pearl necklace gracing her cold throat, rings of gold and sapphire on her still fingers. These were not mementos of a life cut short, but assets, locked away beneath a seal of granite and bronze. His avarice was not a fiery passion, but a patient, chillingly logical conviction that he was merely reclaiming what the wealthy unjustly kept even in death. Now, let the image of that pristine, imposing tomb dissolve. More than a century has passed, and the lens of our investigation shifts to the present day. The Blackwood Mausoleum is a ruin. Its once gleaming marble is now stained and fractured, choked by a relentless tide of thorns and dark unclinging ivy. The iron angels, once weeping with artistic grace, are now pitted with rust, their faces streaked with dark lines that look less like rain and more like real, permanent tears. The entire cemetery of Sorrows Hollow has become a place of profound desolation, a zone of quiet dread shunned by the modern world. It is a plot of land that people do not enter, not out of respect for the interred, but from a deep, instinctual fear, a feeling that the ground itself is somehow contaminated by the weight of its own terrible history. The reason for this deep-seated aversion is a story that has curdled into a local legend, a piece of folklore the few remaining elders of the region refer to only in hushed, reluctant whispers. They call it the Sorrow Plague. This is not a ghost story meant to frighten children around a campfire. It is treated as a grim historical account, a communal trauma so severe that subsequent generations have sought to bury it beneath layers of superstition and deliberate forgetfulness. The legend speaks of a time when grief was not a natural process of healing, but a virulent contagion. It describes a palpable sadness that descended upon the town, an emotional sickness that clung to the air like the mountain fog, systematically draining the very life from the inhabitants of Sorrows Hollow, until only silence remained. The mystery is not if it happened, but how. Official documentation from that specific period in Sorrows Hollow's history is disturbingly incomplete, as if deliberately purged. Town ledgers from 1898 show pages meticulously torn out. Parish registries documenting burials and deaths contain suspicious gaps. The few records that remain attribute an unusually high number of fatalities to ambiguous causes like wasting sickness, or, most chillingly, heartbreak. Yet the oral history, the whispered legend of the sorrow plague, tells a far more nefarious tale. It speaks of a time when the very act of mourning was a death sentence, when the sorrow for a lost loved one seemed to be harvested, amplified, and turned back against the living. It was as if the town's collective grief had been given a monstrous life of its own, an invisible predator that fed on the most vulnerable of human emotions. The legend of the sorrow plague is an echo that still resonates in these hollows, a warning passed down through generations. And since these dark histories travel through time and space, tell us in the comments from which city you are joining our investigation tonight, and the exact local time. With your presence now logged in our chronicle, we can return to the cold earth of 1898, to the very moment the first crack appeared in the placid facade of Sorrow's Hollow. In the cold light of the following day, the facade of normalcy settled over Sorrow's Hollow, thin and brittle like a pane of ice over dark water. Silas, the gravedigger, moved through the town not as a creature of the night, but as one of its many overlooked fixtures. He made his way to a dimly lit pawn shop, a place that thrived on quiet desperation. There, he produced a small, delicate gold ring, its intricate filigree still holding a faint trace of grave dirt. He had pried it from the finger of a woman buried just last spring. The shopkeeper, a man whose eyes missed nothing and questioned little, slid a few paltry coins across the worn wooden counter. The exchange was swift and silent, a transaction of desecration for sustenance. For Silas, this was the grim arithmetic of his existence, a constant reminder of the chasm between his own poverty and the fortunes he interred. It was into this environment of simmering resentment and quiet decay that a new element was introduced. Reverend Theron, recently assigned to the town's parish. He was a young man whose faith was still a bright, earnest flame, not yet tempered into the cynical embers of his predecessor. His gaze was clear and analytical, accustomed to seeking patterns not just in scripture, but in the souls of his flock. During his first Sunday service, he stood at the pulpit and looked out upon a sea of faces that were more than just weary from a life of hard labor. He saw an apathy so profound, a melancholy so thick and uniform, that it felt less like a collection of individual sorrows and more like a shared, atmospheric condition. It was a spiritual malaise that seemed to hang in the very air of the old church, heavier than the scent of old hymnals and damp stone. The sermon he had prepared, one of hope and divine grace, felt utterly inadequate, his words absorbed by the oppressive quiet of the congregation. The faces that looked back at him were masks of listless despair. This was not the sharp, cathartic grief of recent loss he had been trained to minister to. It was something else entirely. This was a chronic lethargy of the spirit, a hollowing out that seemed particularly acute in the wake of Eleanor Blackwood's opulent funeral. The town had performed its public mourning, but instead of the sorrow receding, it appeared to have taken root, metastasizing into a collective despondency that had no discernible source and, most alarmingly, for the young pastor, no apparent end. He felt a chilling premonition that he was not merely a shepherd to a sad flock, but a physician facing a plague of the soul. After the service, as Theron greeted his parishioners at the heavy oak doors, a frail elderly woman named Martha clutched his arm. Her touch was bird-like, but her eyes held a deep, troubled wisdom. "Reverend," she whispered, her voice raspy, "it's the flowers." He leaned in, perplexed. Since the Blackwood girl was laid to rest, no flower will keep on a grave, not for more than a few hours. She explained that fresh blooms, placed on the graves of her husband and son, would turn brown and wither by morning, their petals shriveling as if scorched by an invisible heat. It was a detail that sounded like the rambling of mountain superstition, yet the woman's genuine fear resonated with the unease Theron already felt. He promised to look into it, dismissing it publicly as a quirk of the soil, while privately filing it away as another piece of a puzzle he was beginning to dread solving. Meanwhile, Silas found that the coins from the stolen ring provided little comfort. They were a pittance, an insult that only sharpened his avarice. His thoughts, now an obsessive loop, returned again and again to the Blackwood mausoleum. He could no longer see it as mere stone and metal. In his mind's eye, it was a treasure vault. He spent his days in morbid fantasy, picturing the coffin's silk lining, the weight of the gold jewelry he imagined adorning Eleanor's corpse, the rumors of her burial finery, whispered among the townsfolk, had magnified in his imagination into a king's ransom. This fixation began to eclipse his natural caution. The fear of being caught, the taboo of disturbing such a prominent grave, all of it started to feel secondary to the burning. Cold conviction that what lay within that tomb was his by right of resentment. The unnatural sadness that Reverend Theron had observed in his church was not confined to its stone walls. It bled out into the town itself, a subtle poison in the communal well. The usual sounds of Sorrow's Hollow, the distant clang of the mine, the chatter of neighbors, the laughter of children, were muted, as if a heavy blanket had been thrown over the valley. People moved with a strange deliberation, their shoulders perpetually stooped. Conversations died in the middle of sentences. A peculiar, low hum, almost subliminal, began to permeate the air, especially near the cemetery. It was a vibration felt deep in the bones rather than heard with the ears, a disquieting thrum that seemed to resonate with the latent sorrow in every heart, a bass note to the town's symphony of despair. In his attempts to perform his pastoral duties, Reverend Theron made house calls to families, particularly those who had recently been bereaved. He would sit in their dimly lit parlors, offering scriptures of comfort and resurrection, but his words landed without impact. He observed that their grief was not an active, evolving emotion. It was a static, crushing weight. A widower would stare at his late wife's empty chair not with tears, but with a vacant emptiness. A mother who had lost a child would sit for hours, motionless, her hands idle in her lap. Theron began to feel like he was fighting an invisible tide. He was a man of God, trained to heal the spirit, but he was facing a sickness he couldn't diagnose, a spiritual vampirism that was draining the very will to live from his congregation. Silas, for his part, was hardening his resolve by retreating into his own twisted ideology. As he sharpened the spade he would use to breach the Blackwood tomb, he was not thinking of himself as a common thief. In his mind, he was a revolutionary, an agent of cosmic justice. The Blackwoods and their kind had built their fortunes on the broken backs of men who died in the mines, men he himself had often buried. They had hoarded their wealth in life, and now, in their arrogance, sought to take it with them into the earth. To Silas, opening that grave was not a desecration but a reclamation. He was merely recovering assets that had been stolen from the living, liberating a small fraction of the fortune built on the town's suffering. This cold, calculated justification became a shield against the primal, superstitious fear of retribution from the dead. The spiritual plague manifested in small, deeply unsettling ways that Theron began to document in his private journal. He noted how the town's blacksmith, a man of formidable strength, now let his forge run cold for days at a time, claiming his arms were too heavy to lift the hammer. He wrote of a school teacher who found herself unable to sing the morning hymns with the children, her throat closing with an inexplicable sadness. These were not grand tragedies, but 1,000 tiny surrenders, a slow, collective abdication of life itself. The town wasn't dying loudly, it was quietly, methodically, ceasing to be. Each observation confirmed Theron's terrifying suspicion. This was not natural. An external force was at play, something that was actively cultivating and feeding upon the town's inherent sorrow. On the third night after the old woman's warning about the flowers, under the sliver of a new moon that offered no comfort and little light, Silas made his decision. The obsession had fully consumed him, silencing the last vestiges of his fear. He gathered his tools, not the familiar shovel and pickaxe of his trade, but a darker set, a heavy crowbar to pry stone, a fine chisel to break seals, and a thick burlap sack for his anticipated treasures. He moved with the quiet purpose of a predator. As he walked the familiar path toward the cemetery, the cold Appalachian air filled his lungs, and the almost inaudible hum of the valley seemed to grow in intensity, a silent, expectant thrumming. He was no longer just a gravedigger. Tonight, he was a miner, prospecting not for coal, but for the gilded grief of the Blackwood family. The heavy iron gate of the Blackwood mausoleum groaned in protest as Silas put his weight against it, the sound of rusting metal, a sacrilegious shriek in the hallowed quiet. He slipped inside, pulling the gate closed until it was barely ajar, a sliver of escape should he need it. The air within the small stone structure was colder still, heavy with the scent of stagnant water and old marble. The hum was stronger here, a palpable vibration that seemed to emanate from the very stone of the central sarcophagus. It was a sound that felt ancient and wrong, a low thrumming that was the antithesis of peaceful rest. He set his tools down with a muffled clink, the sound unnervingly loud in the enclosed space. His greed, a cold fire in his belly, was now at war with a primal fear, a superstitious dread that whispered of retribution from beyond the grave. His focus narrowed to the sarcophagus itself, a masterpiece of polished granite sealed with bronze fittings. This was the final barrier. He selected his crowbar, wedging the tip into the fine seam between the lid and the base. He threw his entire body into the effort, his muscles screaming in protest. The cold of the night did nothing to stop the sweat that beaded on his forehead and stung his eyes. For long minutes, the only sounds were his own ragged breaths and the grating of steel against stone. It felt less like grave robbing and more like cracking open a vault. Then, with a final, desperate heave, something gave. A sharp crack, like a bone snapping, echoed in the small chamber, and a hairline fracture appeared in the seal. A puff of air, unnaturally cold and carrying no scent of earthly decay, washed over him, making the hairs on his arms stand on end. With the seal broken, the final stage was a matter of brute force. He worked the crowbar, leveraging the immense weight of the marble lid inch by agonizing inch. The stone scraped and groaned, a sound of profound violation. Silas paused, his chest heaving, his lantern casting his own monstrous, distorted shadow against the wall. He was a man possessed, his mind a feverish canvas painted with visions of glittering diamonds and the soft gleam of pearl. The legends of Eleanor Blackwood's burial finery had taken root in his soul, and the promise of that wealth was the only thing that could shout down the growing chorus of terror in his mind. He set the crowbar aside and placed his raw, calloused hands on the edge of the lid, preparing for the final lift that would reveal his prize. The anticipation was a physical sickness, a knot of avarice and dread in his gut. Heaving with a final, guttural cry, he slid the heavy lid aside. It moved with a terrifying finality, the sound of its movement echoing like a closing chapter. He raised his lantern high, its flickering light spilling into the dark interior of the coffin. And then, he froze. His mind, so full of anticipated riches, went utterly blank. There was no body, no pale, serene face of Eleanor Blackwood, no silk lining, no gold, no pearls. The space was not filled with the gentle decay of a human form, but with something impossible, something his mind refused to comprehend. The lantern light glinted off polished brass in the dark, rich grain of a wood he had never seen before. Where a corpse should have lain, there was a machine, a thing of gears and tubes arranged with a terrible, alien precision. It was an artifact of grotesque beauty, a blasphemous fusion of mechanics and anatomy. It had the rough dimensions of a human torso, but it was a heart of artifice, a series of interlocking gears, crafted from a dull, non-reflective brass, turned with an impossibly slow, measured rhythm, unpowered by any visible spring or steam. They moved with the deliberate, inexorable pace of a glacier, or of grief itself. Glass tubes, like crystalline veins, snaked through the wooden chassis, and within them, a faint, sickly green light pulsed in time with the turning gears. It was the source of the hum, a low, resonant moan that was not a sound of function, but of feeling. It was a lamentation given mechanical form, a machine designed to mimic the very act of breathing in sorrow. Silas stared, his greed dissolving into a profound, chilling bewilderment. His bewilderment curdled into a strange, frustrated anger. This had to be a trick, a ruse to hide the real treasure. Driven by this last vestige of his avarice, he reached a trembling hand into the coffin, his fingers brushing against the cold, smooth surface of the wooden frame. He intended to feel for a false bottom, a hidden compartment. Instead, his thumb inadvertently grazed one of the slowly turning brass gears. The moment his skin made contact, a shockwave of pure, unadulterated despair slammed into his consciousness. It was not a physical jolt of electricity, but an invasive psychic cold that bypassed his flesh and pierced the very marrow of his soul. It was the feeling of 1,000 funerals, of every whispered goodbye, of every final breath, all concentrated into a single, unbearable point of contact. In that fleeting second, his mind was flooded with a torrent of vicarious agony. He felt the crushing weight on the chest of a miner trapped in a cave-in, the hollow emptiness of a widow setting a table for one, the sharp, piercing cry of a mother seeing her child's empty cradle. These were not his memories, not his losses, but he experienced them with an intensity that was absolute. He felt the raw, unprocessed grief of the entire hollow, the sorrow that had seeped into the very soil, all of it amplified and focused into a single, weaponized wave of emotion. The machine was not merely an object, it was a psychic lens, a collector and amplifier for the town's pain. The despair was so potent, so overwhelming, that it brought him to his knees, a silent scream trapped in his throat. Instinct, raw and primal, finally took over. The part of his brain that knew of predators and poisons screamed at him to flee. He snatched his hand back as if from a white-hot forge, a strangled gasp escaping his lips. His meticulously planned theft, his dreams of wealth, all vaporized in an instant, replaced by a singular, overwhelming need to escape the presence of this unholy thing. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled panic, he lunged forward and slammed the heavy marble lid back into place. The sound was a deafening boom, a crack of thunder in the confined space, a definitive, percussive end to his profane endeavor. He scrambled backward, kicking over his lantern in his haste. The glass shattered, the flame hissed and died, plunging the mausoleum into an almost absolute darkness. He fled, blindly, recklessly. He stumbled out of the mausoleum and into the night, the thorny arms of overgrown rose bushes tearing at his clothes. He did not look back. He ran with the desperate energy of a man convinced he was being chased, not by a physical pursuer, but by the memory of the feeling he had touched, by the soul-crushing hum that now seemed to be locked inside his own skull. In the chaos of his panicked flight, as he slammed the lid shut, a small, intricate brass gear had been dislodged from the machine. It had been jolted from its axle, tumbling silently onto the lip of the sarcophagus. As Silas stumbled away, the tiny cog rolled off the edge and, with a final, damning twist of fate, fell unheard into the deep, open pocket of his heavy wool coat. He was now tethered to the horror he was fleeing. Silas did not stop running until the rusted iron gate of the cemetery was far behind him. He burst through the door of his remote, squalid cabin, through the heavy bolt, and collapsed against the rough-hewn wood, his lungs burning. He was trembling uncontrollably, not from the cold but from a deep internal shock. The image of the mechanical heart was burned into his mind, its slow, rhythmic pulse now a phantom echo of his own frantic heartbeat. The night returned to its oppressive silence, but the equilibrium of Sorrow's Hollow had been irrevocably broken. The gravedigger had not simply desecrated a tomb, he had disturbed a slumbering horror, and unknowing, he now carried a small, ticking piece of its heart away with him into the dark. The days that followed the desecration of the Blackwood tomb were, for Silas, a slow descent into a private hell. He did not leave his small, isolated cabin, bolting the door and shuttering the single window against a world he was now convinced was watching him. The profound psychic shock he had endured in the mausoleum had receded, leaving behind a residue of hyper-vigilant terror. Every creak of the cabin's timbers was the sound of approaching footsteps. Every rustle of leaves in the wind was a whispered accusation. He existed in a state of suspended panic, a man marooned on a tiny island of sanity, with the tide of his own guilt rising around him. It was during a fit of uncontrollable shivering on that first morning that he plunged a hand into his coat pocket, searching for a tobacco pouch, and his fingers closed around the source of his undoing. It was a small, cold, intricately machined brass gear, no larger than a silver dollar, its teeth cut with an inhuman precision. The artifact was not inert. In the relative silence of his cabin, away from the ambient thrum of the valley, Silas could feel a faint vibration emanating from it, a low, almost subliminal hum that seemed to match a frequency deep within his own bones. This was not the deafening moan of the machine in the tomb. This was a personal, intimate resonance. As he held it, he found that the simmering resentment he had nursed for years, his cold justification for his crimes, was being amplified into something monstrous. His bitterness curdled into a debilitating paranoia. The memory of the pawned ring, the faces of the dead he had violated, the wealth he coveted, all of it swirled in his mind, no longer a source of grim pride, but a cacophony of self-loathing and fear. The gear was a lens, focusing all the darkness within him back upon himself, transforming his own soul into his tormentor. Unable to bear its presence, he unbolted his door and flung the small gear as far as he could into the dense, dark woods surrounding his cabin. He watched it disappear into the undergrowth. A tiny glint of malevolent brass, and a wave of profound relief washed over him. He felt lighter, as if a physical weight had been lifted from his chest. He spent the rest of the day in a state of fragile calm, telling himself the nightmare was over, that he had merely suffered a hallucination brought on by fear and the enclosed air of the tomb. He tried to rationalize the impossible machine, to reduce it to a trick of the light. Yet as night began to seep back into the hollow, a deeper, more insidious dread began to take root. It was the chilling suspicion that an object born of such unnatural purpose could not be discarded with such mundane ease. The forest outside his window no longer felt like a hiding place, but like a patient entity, waiting. While Silas wrestled with his personal demon, Reverend Theron was confronting a communal one. The spiritual malaise he had observed had escalated into a tangible crisis. The first official casualty of the sorrow plague was recorded. A young man named Thomas Chow, who had lost his wife in childbirth a month prior, was found in his home, having passed away in his sleep. The town doctor, a man of limited imagination and resources, could find no physical cause of death. On the certificate, in the space for the cause, he wrote a single chilling word: heartbreak. When the certificate reached Theron's desk at the parish, the word seemed to lift off the page. This was no longer a matter of pastoral concern or local superstition. This was an epidemic. He was a man of faith, but he was also a man of logic, and he knew that hearts, while fragile, did not simply break without cause. This official documentation was the catalyst that moved Theron from observation to investigation. The town's apathy had crossed a threshold into lethal passivity, and he felt a profound sense of responsibility, a conviction that a hostile, unseen force was preying upon his flock. He resolved to search the parish archives, a repository of the town's history that stretched back to its founding in the mid-18th century. His predecessor had dismissed the archives as a dusty collection of irrelevant bygones, but Theron suspected that if an evil of this nature had befallen Sorrow's Hollow, it might not be for the first time. He was searching for a precedent, a historical echo, a forgotten chronicle of a similar spiritual sickness. He prayed he was wrong, but the methodical, systematic nature of the town's decline felt practiced, as if following the steps of an ancient, terrible pattern. His fears were confirmed with brutal speed. Within the next 48 hours, 2 more deaths were reported, each echoing the first with terrifying fidelity. The first was an old miner, a widower for 2 decades, who was found lifeless in his porch chair, gazing toward the distant hills. The second was a young woman, recently jilted by a lover, who simply failed to wake one morning. In both cases, the doctor, now visibly shaken, could find no physical ailment, no sign of struggle or poison. He reluctantly recorded the same impossible cause: heartbreak. To Reverend Theron, this was no longer a pattern. It was a signature. Something was targeting those already burdened by grief, isolating them in their sorrow, and then, somehow, extinguishing the very spark of life. The town was not just sad, it was being systematically, quietly, murdered by its own grief. For Silas, the second night brought a new dimension of horror. He awoke from a fitful sleep, his sheets soaked in a cold sweat, the phantom sensation of the psychic shock still tingling in his hand. His gaze fell upon the rough-hewn wooden table beside his bed. There, placed dead center in a sliver of moonlight filtering through a crack in the shutters, sat the small brass gear. Its teeth seemed to gleam with a smug, intelligent malice. There was no rational explanation for its return. The woods were dense, the ground covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves. He had thrown it with all his might. The impossibility of the event shattered the last of his fragile defenses against madness. The gear was not an object he possessed. It was an entity that had attached itself to him, a parasitic artifact that had chosen him as its host, its anchor in the world of the living. The hum was more distinct now, a constant, low thrum that was no longer just a vibration but an insidious whisper at the edge of his hearing. In its monotonous drone, Silas began to hear voices. He heard the faint, disappointed sigh of the woman whose ring he had pawned. He heard the rattling cough of a miner he had buried without ceremony. These were not memories. They were accusations, broadcast directly into his skull by the tiny, malevolent machine. His cabin, once his refuge, became his prison. He began to see accusing faces in the wood grain of the walls, to feel the weight of judgmental eyes peering through the cracks. He barricaded the door with his only table, his paranoia now a living thing, feeding on the guilt that the gear amplified with every slow, inexorable turn of its phantom machinery within his mind. He was no longer just a thief. He was the haunted curator of a single, damning piece of evidence. In a surge of desperate rage, Silas decided he had to destroy it. He grabbed the gear and placed it on the hard-packed earth floor of his cabin. He took up a heavy blacksmith's hammer, a tool he had once used to break frozen ground in the winter, and brought it down with all his strength. But a strange thing happened. The hammer did not make contact. It felt as if he were striking solid, unyielding iron, though the gear itself was small and appeared delicate. The hammer recoiled violently, flying from his grasp and clattering against the wall. At the same time, the hum from the gear exploded into a silent, psychic scream that flooded his mind with pure agony. The wave of despair was 100 times more powerful than what he had felt in the tomb. It dropped him to his knees, clutching his head, his vision blurring as the concentrated sorrow of the entire valley washed over him. He had learned a terrible lesson. The artifact could not be undone by simple, physical violence. Reverend Theron's investigation began in the church's undercroft, a cold, stone-walled room that served as the parish archive. The air was thick with the scent of decaying paper and dry rot, a library of forgotten souls. Rows of wooden shelves sagged under the weight of leather-bound ledgers, baptismal records, and funeral registries dating back over 150 years. The silence was absolute, broken only by the scratching of Theron's pen as he began his methodical work. He felt like an archaeologist, carefully brushing away the dust of generations, searching for the bones of a truth the town had tried to bury. He started with the most recent records, working his way backward through time, cross-referencing death certificates with parish logs, looking for any anomaly, any past event that mirrored the current unfolding horror. For hours, he found nothing but the mundane chronicles of life and death in a hardscrabble mountain town, epidemics of influenza, mining accidents, the steady toll of childbirth and old age. The records were tragically predictable. Yet, as he delved deeper into the late 18th century, he noticed a subtle disruption. A pastor's handwriting would change abruptly, or there would be a series of entries that seemed unusually agitated. It was in a large, unassuming tome titled Ecclesiastical Laws and Parish Governance, 1750 to 1800 dollars, that he found it. The book felt oddly balanced. Running his hand along the thick pages, he felt an indentation. A section had been expertly hollowed out, creating a hidden compartment. Tucked inside was another book, a small, personal journal, bound in cracked black leather, with no title or marking of any kind. A profound coldness emanated from it, a sense of dormant secrecy that made Theron hesitate before opening it. He carried the journal to his desk, the feel of the cold leather unsettling against his skin. The book fell open to a page of dense, spidery script, written not in English, but in an archaic German dialect. By a stroke of providence, Theron had studied the language during his seminary years, a requirement for reading the works of the great theologians. As he began the slow, arduous process of translation, he felt a distinct sense of trespass, as if he were violating a grave not of earth, but of memory. The words on the page were not a simple record of events. They were a confession, a warning, a frantic testimony of a horror witnessed and barely survived. The author was a man named Pastor August Richter, and the date of the first entry was 1788. It was a voice from the grave, and Theron was its first audience in over a century. Pastor Richter's journal began with the arrival of a family to Sorrow's Hollow, then a nascent settlement. They were the von Kleists, a family of 3, a father and 2 sons, who had emigrated from the Black Forest region of Germany. They were master clockmakers and artisans of unparalleled skill, but they had been driven from their homeland under accusations of heresy. Richter described them as quiet, intensely private men who held a strange, unsettling philosophy. They did not speak of God or salvation, but of energies, resonances, and the mechanics of the soul. They were obsessed with the nature of human emotion, particularly grief, which they did not see as a spiritual trial to be endured, but as a raw, quantifiable force of nature, a power source waiting to be harnessed. Richter wrote, "They speak of sorrow not as a poet, but as an engineer. It is a blasphemy that chills my very soul." The journal entries grew more frantic as Richter secretly observed the von Kleists' work. He detailed their core, heretical belief that the universe contained a subtle energy field, an ether doloris, or field of sorrow, which was generated and enriched by the powerful emotions of sentient beings experiencing loss. They believed that a great tragedy, like a death, released a tremendous burst of this energy, which was then squandered, dissipating uselessly into the cosmos. To the von Kleists, this was a cosmic waste. They saw themselves not as servants of God, but as pioneers on the frontier of a new, terrible science. Their life's work, their true purpose in the mountains of Appalachia, was to build a device capable of tapping into this field, of harvesting the very essence of human pain for their own inscrutable ends. The pastor's script became nearly illegible as he described his dawning horror. Then, the journal named the abomination. "Tonight, I saw it," Richter wrote, his ink smudged as if by a trembling hand. "They call it the lamentum machina. It is a heart of brass and dark wood, a thing of gears that turn without a spring, powered by a force I cannot comprehend. They claim it is a reservoir, a battery to store the energy of grief for later study. But I saw the faint, sickly light pulsing within its crystalline veins, and I know its true purpose. It does not simply store grief, it calls to it. It acts as a beacon, a lodestone for sorrow, drawing it from the afflicted and concentrating it. It is a profanity against the natural order, a blasphemy that seeks to mechanize the soul." Richter chronicled how he led the town elders to drive the von Kleists out, but his final entry was filled with dread. "They are gone, but I fear their machine is not. I fear they have buried its heart here in our consecrated ground, waiting." Theron let the journal fall from his hands. The ancient words echoed in the silent room, forging an unbreakable chain between the past and the present. The lamentum machina, a heart of brass and dark wood, a machine that feeds on grief. It all clicked into place with the terrible finality of a tomb lid sliding shut. The withering flowers on the graves, the oppressive, unnatural sadness hanging over the town, the escalating deaths from heartbreak. It was not a plague. It was a harvest. The machine, dormant for a century, had been reawakened. And Theron knew, with a certainty that defied logic and embraced a colder truth, that it must be housed in the most opulent, most recent monument to grief in the entire cemetery, the Blackwood tomb. The resting place of Eleanor Blackwood was not a grave, it was a nest. His mind reeled, but his purpose sharpened to a fine point. He had to know more. He had to confirm his theory. There was only one person whose daily life brought him into constant, intimate contact with the graves, the soil, the very atmosphere of the cemetery. A man who might have noticed a change, a disturbance, however small. The gravedigger. Theron left the archives, the journal of Pastor Richter clutched in his hand like a holy relic, and made his way through the dying town toward Silas's remote cabin. The structure was even more dilapidated than he remembered, a portrait of neglect. The windows were crudely boarded from the inside, and a heavy wooden table was braced against the door. It was not the home of a recluse, it was the fortress of a man under siege. After several minutes of loud, insistent knocking, the door scraped open a few inches, held by a chain. Silas's face appeared in the gloom, and Theron was shocked by his appearance. He was haggard, his eyes wide and bloodshot, darting around as if expecting an attack. He was a man hollowed out by terror. "Silas," Theron began, his voice steady but firm. I need to ask you something. Have you seen anything unusual at the cemetery lately? Anything at all out of the ordinary near the Blackwood mausoleum? At the mention of the mausoleum, a flicker of raw panic crossed Silas's face. The tiny gear in his pocket seemed to pulse with cold malice, its silent hum screaming a warning in his mind. He knows. It's a trap. Terrified of being exposed as a thief and unable to explain the true horror, Silas chose the coward's path. "No, Reverend," he stammered, his eyes refusing to meet Theron's. "Nothing. It's all as it should be." Quiet, the lie was a tangible thing, hanging in the cold air between them, and Theron knew, with a sinking heart, that the gravedigger was now part of the terrible secret. The gravedigger's lie, thin and brittle as old bone, shattered against the Reverend's cold certainty. Theron did not flinch or raise his voice. He simply held up the small, leather-bound journal, its presence in the dim cabin feeling like a weighty judgment. "Your silence condemns you, Silas, but this book has already spoken," he said, his tone that of a scholar revealing a grim text. "I know what is in that tomb." An 18th-century pastor named Richter chronicled its creation. He wrote of a family of heretical clockmakers, banished for their unholy work. He described a device built to interact with human sorrow, a blasphemy of wood and brass. He gave it a name that has haunted my thoughts since I read it, the Lamentum Machina. The name hung in the air, an indictment that Silas had no defense against. The name, Lamentum Machina, struck Silas not as a revelation, but as a diagnosis for his own spiraling madness. It was the key that unlocked the full horror of his experience, giving a name to the impossible thing in the coffin and the malevolent intelligence he felt in his pocket. The gear, as if hearing its master's title, seemed to pulse with a sudden, vicious cold against his thigh. All the strength went out of him. The paranoia, the phantom whispers, the crushing weight of the town's amplified grief. It was all real. His carefully constructed fortress of denial collapsed into dust, leaving him exposed and trembling in the ruins. He looked at the Reverend, and for the first time in his life, the gravedigger felt a desperate, primal need not for wealth, but for absolution. The dam of his terror finally broke, and the confession poured out of him in a ragged, desperate torrent. He spared no detail, his voice a choked whisper as he recounted his avarice, the violation of the tomb, and the soul-freezing moment he laid eyes on the mechanical heart. He described the psychic shockwave that had floored him, a feeling of concentrated despair that had stained his very soul. Then, his hand trembling so violently he could barely control it, he reached into his coat and retrieved the source of his ongoing torment. He held out the small brass gear on his dirt-caked palm. "It won't leave me," he rasped, his eyes wide with the terror of a man haunted by something he cannot fight. "I threw it away. I tried to smash it. It always comes back." Theron looked from the terrified man to the tiny, malevolent object gleaming in his hand. He could feel its wrongness, a subtle but profound spiritual sickness that emanated from it like a cold draft. The intricate teeth of the gear were not merely a feat of craftsmanship, they were a statement of intent, a desire to mechanize the unmechanizable. In that moment, the Reverend's perspective shifted irrevocably. He understood that he was no longer facing a common sinner, a simple thief to be judged by the laws of God and man. Silas was both a perpetrator and the machine's first victim, a man physically tethered to the abomination he had unleashed. His role was no longer that of an investigator, but of an exorcist, facing a demon made not of spirit, but of cogs and sorrow. "There is only one path to redemption for you, and one path to salvation for this town," Theron declared, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We must face it. Together." Silas, broken and devoid of his own will, could only nod in mute agreement. The decision made, a heavy and profound silence fell between them as they prepared to depart. They left the cabin, the fortress of fear now an abandoned shell, and began the solemn walk back to the cemetery. They moved as a single unit of grim purpose, a strange pairing of faith and sacrilege united against a common foe. The air of Sorrow's Hollow grew colder with every step they took, and the low, pervasive hum of the valley seemed to solidify, becoming a conscious, waiting presence. As they approached the cemetery gates, the wrongness of the place became a physical assault on the senses. The hum was no longer a subliminal vibration felt in the bones. It was now an audible, low-frequency moan that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath their feet. It was a sound of immense, ageless grief, and it made the fillings in their teeth ache. The air smelled of ozone and something else, a cloyingly sweet odor like rotting flowers and cold metal. Near the Blackwood mausoleum, the effect was magnified. Every flower, every blade of grass, every living plant within a 20-foot radius had not merely withered. It had turned to a black, brittle dust that stirred in the wind like cremated remains. The ground itself looked blighted, starved of life. With a shared, unspoken understanding, they put their shoulders to the heavy iron gate of the mausoleum and forced it open. The groan of the hinges was drowned out by the machine's constant, mournful thrum. Inside, the air was thick and electric, vibrating with a palpable power that made their skin crawl. There was no need for a lantern. A sickening, green-tinged light pulsed from the seams of the granite sarcophagus, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like tormented spirits. Together, they braced themselves against the coffin, their hands flat on the cold marble. This time, the act was not one of desecration or theft, but of lancing a festering wound. With a final, desperate heave, they slid the lid aside, unleashing the full, concentrated horror of the lamentum machina into the night. The artifact that lay within was monstrously transformed. It had grown. The dark wood and brass chassis seemed to have fused with the stone of the sarcophagus itself, spreading like a metallic fungus. Its gears, now twice as numerous, spun with a frantic, hungry energy. The glass tubes, once pulsing with a faint glow, now blazed with a diseased, verdant light, the fluid within churning violently. And the sound, the moan, was no longer a whisper but a wail, the sound of 1,000 souls weeping in unison, a chorus of despair given mechanical voice. The machine was not a static object. It was a living, breathing entity, engorged and bloated from its relentless feeding upon the sorrow of Sorrow's Hollow. It was awake, it was powerful, and it was ravenous. A horrifying realization dawned on Reverend Theron as he stared at the abomination, the words from Pastor Richter's journal echoing in his mind. He was wrong, Theron breathed, his voice a mixture of awe and terror. He thought they built it to store grief, like a battery, but it's not a reservoir. It's a parasite. He turned to Silas, his eyes wide with the terrible clarity of the truth. Don't you see? It doesn't just collect the town's sadness, it amplifies it. It creates a feedback loop. It radiates an aura of misery, making the living more susceptible to grief, and then it feeds on the intensified sorrow it has cultivated. It is a perpetual engine of pain, turning our very souls into its fuel. The town was not just being harvested, it was being farmed. They had to destroy it. There was no other option. To leave it here would be to condemn not only Sorrow's Hollow, but any who might stumble upon it in the future. This is not a creation of God, Theron declared, his voice ringing with newfound conviction. It is a cancer of the soul and it must be cut out. He scanned the interior of the tomb, his eyes falling upon a heavy, ornate iron crucifix that had been bolted to the wall as a decoration, a symbol of faith now destined to be a weapon. Silas, seeing the monster he had unleashed, felt a surge of purpose replace his fear. This was his chance, his only chance, for redemption. He would not just be an accomplice to its destruction, he would be the instrument. As they moved to act, the machine defended itself. There was no physical lash or mechanical appendage. The assault was silent, invisible, and infinitely more devastating. A psychic tsunami of pure, undiluted hopelessness crashed over them, a wave of emotional force so potent it buckled their knees. It was the absolute certainty of failure, the crushing weight of every loss they had ever known, and the cold, rational knowledge that all struggle was pointless. The will to fight, to move, to even breathe, was systematically stripped away, replaced by an overwhelming desire to simply lie down on the cold stone floor and let the end come. It was the feeling of drowning, not in water, but in utter despair. The machine, with a cold and terrifying intelligence, tailored its assault. It focused on Silas, delving into the guilt that riddled his soul and turning it into a weapon against him. His mind became a horrifying gallery of his own sins. He saw the pale, accusing faces of the corpses he had robbed, their dead eyes staring at him not with anger, but with a profound, soul-withering disappointment. The resentment that had fueled his entire life was twisted and reflected back at him, showing him that his poverty and misery were not injustices to be rectified, but punishments he had earned. He felt the crushing weight of his own worthlessness, a despair so complete that it paralyzed him where he stood, his hands falling limp at his sides. For Reverend Theron, the attack was more insidious, targeting not his guilt, but the very foundation of his faith. The machine flooded his mind with a cold, clockwork vision of the cosmos, a universe of gears and levers utterly devoid of a divine presence. It whispered to him in the silent language of doubt, showing him that his prayers were only meaningless vibrations in empty air, that souls were not eternal spirits but temporary electrical impulses that simply ceased to be. He saw visions of his flock dying from heartbreak, their souls not ascending to heaven but being consumed, extinguished, and used as fuel to turn a brass gear. It was a profound theological horror, the ultimate blasphemy, the reduction of all faith, hope, and love to mere mechanics. On the verge of succumbing, his spirit drowning in the cold void of the machine's vision, Theron's hand instinctively tightened around the simple iron crucifix he wore around his neck. The feel of the cold, solid metal in his palm was an anchor, a piece of irrefutable reality in the psychic storm. In that moment of contact, he realized the machine's fundamental deception. It was a parasite, an amplifier. It could not create despair from nothing. It could only magnify what was already there. "It lies," he roared, his voice cutting through the psychic drone. He turned to the paralyzed Silas, his eyes blazing with a defiant fire. "Its power is our own sorrow, Silas. We are feeding it. Do not give it what it wants." The words were a declaration of war, a refusal to surrender the human spirit to the mechanics of despair. Theron's words, a raw cry of defiance, were a crack of thunder in the psychic storm. They were the catalyst. As the wave of manufactured despair threatened to pull him under, Theron fumbled for the small vial of holy water he carried. A relic of his faith he now wielded as a weapon. With a desperate prayer, he flung the contents in a wide arc, spattering both the paralyzed Silas and the pulsating machine. On Silas's skin, it was a shocking, icy jolt that cut through the psychic haze. On the machine's hot brass chassis, the sanctified water sizzled and hissed, evaporating in a cloud of acrid steam. The machine's hum pitched into a shriek of rage and pain, a feedback screech that was felt not in the ears, but as a violent pressure against the skull. The parasitic entity, for the first time, had been wounded. That jolt of cold and the machine's psychic shriek ripped Silas from his prison of guilt. He saw Theron, his face a mask of resolute fury, and he understood. The path to his redemption was not in passive surrender but in violent action. His gaze fell upon the heavy iron crucifix bolted to the wall, and in that instant, it was transformed in his eyes. It was no longer a symbol of a faith he didn't share. It was a tool, a hammer, a sanctified weapon perfectly suited for a task of ultimate destruction. Ignoring the chorus of phantom accusations that still swirled at the edges of his mind, he lunged forward, his hands closing around the cold, solid iron. A singular, burning purpose replaced his terror. He was the one who woke this thing. He would be the one to put it back to sleep. As Silas tore the heavy crucifix from its mountings, the lamentum machina unleashed its final, most desperate defense. It abandoned its widespread assault on the town and focused its entire, accumulated power on the two men in the tomb. It did not show them visions of horror, but of temptation. It flooded Theron's mind with the image of a healed, joyous congregation, a future where he was lauded as a savior, if only he would walk away now. It offered Silas a vision of escape, a life of quiet anonymity, free from guilt, the stolen gear in his pocket turning to harmless dust. It was a promise of peace, the ultimate temptation for souls locked in a desperate struggle. But Theron began to chant, his voice a low, steady recitation of scripture, a shield of words against the psychic onslaught. Fueled by the Reverend's faith, Silas raised the iron cross high, its shape a dark silhouette against the machine's sickening green glow. With a final, guttural roar that was part prayer and part curse, Silas brought the iron crucifix down with all his might. He aimed for the very center of the artifact, where the largest of the glass tubes pulsed like a diseased heart. The point of impact was precise. There was a sound unlike any other, a crystalline shattering that was simultaneously the shriek of a living thing. The green light within the core did not extinguish. It imploded, collapsing in on itself with a silent, violent rush. For a single, breathless moment, there was absolute silence and darkness. Then, the machine released a final, inhuman wail, a sound of tearing metal and cosmic fury that echoed out of the mausoleum and across the valley. The entire structure of brass and dark wood shuddered, and then, with a terrible finality, crumbled into a pile of fine, black dust and inert rusted fragments. The hum was gone. The effect on Sorrow's Hollow was instantaneous and profound. It was as if a pressure valve had been released on the soul of the entire valley. In homes and on silent streets, people stirred, blinking as if waking from a long, oppressive, and feverish dream. The blacksmith, who had sat staring at his cold forge for days, suddenly stood, picked up his hammer, and felt its familiar, comforting weight, the strength having returned to his arms. The schoolteacher, who had been unable to speak above a whisper, found herself humming an old folk tune, the melody a forgotten friend. There was no sudden joy, but a slow, dawning sense of relief, a quiet astonishment at the lifting of a burden they had not realized was so heavy. The sickness was gone, and in its place, a strange, peaceful, and almost unnerving stillness settled over the town. In the now silent mausoleum, covered in the fine, dark dust of the destroyed machine, the weight of a different burden settled upon Silas. With the parasitic artifact gone, the guilt that remained was his own, pure and unamplified. It was a cold, heavy stone in his soul. He looked at the wreckage, then at Reverend Theron, whose face was grim but held no condemnation. No words were exchanged, none were needed. The immensity of his crime, and the terrible nature of his redemption, was a chasm of silence between them. That night, under the cover of the new and fragile piece he had helped to create, Silas, the gravedigger, simply vanished. He left his wretched cabin, his tarnished tools, and the few stolen coins he possessed. He walked away from Sorrow's Hollow and out of the pages of its history, leaving no trace but a ghost story. The true account of that night was known only to one man, and he would carry it to his grave. Reverend Theron never spoke of the lamentum machina, of brass gears or psychic parasites. He chronicled the events in a final, cryptic entry in Pastor Richter's journal, describing the destruction of an unholy affliction before sealing the book and hiding it once more within the archives, a secret for another generation if the need should ever arise. For the people of Sorrow's Hollow, the sorrow plague ended as inexplicably as it had begun. The sudden cessation of deaths, the lifting of the communal despair, became part of the mystery. In time, the events curdled into a cautionary legend, a whispered tale about the dangers of excessive grief, a warning that the mountains themselves could catch the sickness of sorrow and turn it against you. The Blackwood mausoleum, the epicenter of the horror, became a place of permanent, unspoken dread. The Blackwood family, having lost their only heir and finding their monument shunned with a superstitious terror they could not comprehend, eventually abandoned their coal empire and the town built on it. They left Sorrow's Hollow to its ghosts. The mausoleum was never tended to again. It was left to the mercy of the Appalachian seasons, its fine marble cracking under the pressure of ice and roots, its iron angels weeping long, permanent tears of rust. It became a taboo ruin, a skeletal reminder of a trauma the community had collectively, instinctively, chosen to forget. The story twisted itself, the legend claiming the ground was soured not by a machine, but by the weight of the Blackwoods' own arrogant and ostentatious grief. More than a century has passed. Our chronicle returns, one last time to the present day. The Blackwood mausoleum is gone, its foundations reclaimed by the earth, its grandeur reduced to an unmarked patch of ground barely distinguishable from the surrounding forest floor. A young child, chasing a butterfly, wanders into the old, abandoned cemetery. They feel no dread, no ancestral terror. The hum is a distant memory, the story a forgotten whisper. The child, seeing a spot where the earth looks different, disturbed, stops. They are not afraid. With the simple, unburdened grace of youth, they pick a single, wild columbine from the weeds and lay it gently on the ground. It is not a gesture of pain, or mourning, or remembrance of a specific soul. It is just a flower, on the earth, a testament to the quiet, stubborn persistence of life. The history of Silas and the grief machine is a chilling testament to a terrifying possibility, that the deepest of human emotions can be a power source, a force to be harvested, twisted, and weaponized. The tale leaves us adrift on a dark and unsettling question. When faced with an impossible sorrow, is the act of forgetting the only path to salvation, or is it the ultimate betrayal of those we have lost? The archives of history are filled with such stories, chapters of horror that have been deliberately erased or allowed to fade into myth, to ensure these darkest parts of our shared past are never truly lost, and that the warnings they contain are preserved for the future. Subscribe to our channel and help us maintain the archive of shadows.